Hello, everybody. Welcome to another class on Web Yeshiva. I'm David Sedley. This is the fourth and final class in the series of Haggadot in their time. Don't worry, there'll be more classes after Pesach. You can sign up for them already now. This last class is going to be about modern tragic Haggadot, 20th century. Well, no, that's not true. During and post-Holocaust Haggadot. Which are very clearly a product of their time, and which unfortunately don't need as much context to understand. So I want to look at one Haggadah that came out during World War II, one Haggadah that came out immediately after World War II, and then, time permitting, very briefly, a more recent Haggadah. So I can't read the text because WebEx doesn't believe in Hebrew, but we all know this text anyway, which is B'chol dor v'dor chayev adam lirot et atzmo ki lo yatsa miMitzrayim. In every generation, a person must view themselves as if they left Egypt. Shneimar, as it says in Shemot, v'higadta levincha b'yomahu le'emor, you shall tell your child on this day, saying, B'vozeh asa li Hashem, because of this, God did for me, b'tzeiti miMitzrayim, when I left Egypt. And that is, that's the Mishnah. We recite that in the Haggadah. That's also the answer to the sons in the four questions of the sons. Meaning, the goal of Pesach Seder is not to say long, complicated Divrei Torah or to read the Haggadah in whatever language. The goal is to experience leaving Egypt yourself. And these three Haggadot, are allowed the people involved in that generation to experience leaving their own personal Egypt, or collective communal Egypt at that time. So the Gemara and Brachot. At the end of this, I'll come back to the beginning of this Gemara, but the Gemara Brachot says, in the context of remembering the Exodus from Egypt, behold, I will do new things, and now it will spring forth. That's a verse in Isaiah. Tnei Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef says, Zel Milchemet Gog uMagog. This refers to Armageddon, the war of Gog and Magog, and people will speak about that war that will be at the end of history, and that war, that experience will be so tragic and so difficult that everything else previous will be forgotten. The Gemara says, what can this be compared to? L'adam shehaya holech b'derech, a man was walking on the road, u'paka bo ze'ev, and he was attacked by a wolf. V'nitzal mimeno, and he was saved miraculously from the wolf. And so from then on, every time people said, tell us the story, Granddad, he would say the story of being saved from the wolf. Pagabo Ari, another time though, he was attacked by a lion, v'nitzal mimeno, and he was saved from the lion. Then he wouldn't tell the story of the wolf because the story of the miracle of the lion was greater. Pagabo Nachash, then he was attacked by a snake, and he was saved by it. He forgot about the story of the wolf and the story of the lion. And he would tell the story of being saved from the snake. Af Kol Yisrael. Similarly, all of Israel, Tzarot Achronot Mishkachot Et Harishonot. The latter trials, troubles, tribulations make them forget the earlier troubles, so that in the context, the implication is people won't remember the exodus from Egypt because they will have experienced greater and worse persecutions more recently, which will make them forget the persecution of Egypt. And so that's what we're talking about tonight. People who experienced worse persecutions and therefore re-experienced the Haggadah and the Exodus from Egypt in a different way because of the more recent troubles they had experienced. So the first Haggadah I want to speak about is called the Hitler Haggadah. Now, that is a strange name for a Haggadah. It is not the Haggadah used by Hitler, of course, obviously. And I actually bumped into this Haggadah. It was doing a round on social media as a meme. People were laughing at this Haggadah. Ha ha. Look at it, it's Hitler's Haggadah, and you can buy it in Walmart and you can buy it online and whatever it is. But actually, it is a Haggadah that was written by a Jew or perhaps used in a Jewish community that had been saved from Hitler. And the author called it the Hitler Haggadah. Now, the author, as you can see on the left here, Hitler, now he wrote it not in Hebrew and not in Aramaic, but in Judeo-Arabic, which basically means Arabic words, but using Hebrew letters to spell out those words. A little bit like Yiddish is High German written in Hebrew letters and then made more Jewish. So this is written in a language that, to be honest, I don't understand. Or I could fake a couple of the words, but most of it I didn't understand. And I asked all the online translating and AI services I could find, and no one else could translate it either. So my translations or thereof are just excerpts I found otherwise. Anyway, you can see on the left is Haggadah de Hitler. It is the Haggadah of Hitler, written by Nissim ben Shimon, somebody called Nissim ben Shimon. Now, he calls himself in English, or I guess in French, Simon Coiffeur, which means Simon the hairdresser. We have an address, Place du Général Bremont in Rabat. It was written or published in Morocco, and there seems to be a telephone number, 3211. I don't know if that's the whole phone number. And we also have dedication at the very bottom. There's a visitor censure. The censor has approved this, and there's a number for the of the censor's approval. So written in 1943 or published in 1943 in Morocco. Now, what is the context for this? The context is that when we think of the Holocaust, most of us tend to think primarily about Europe, Eastern Europe, and then a bit less in Western Europe, if you've read the Diary of Anne Frank. And then some people also think about the Greek islands and places like that. But there were also the Nazis, or at least the Vichy government, that controlled two of the biggest countries in North Africa, also was under effectively under Nazi rule. So following the 1940, this is taken from the Jewish Virtual Library, but just to give the context, and I guess really I'm saying this to remind us all that that not only Ashkenazi Jews were affected by the Holocaust. Following the 1940 Franco-German armistice, Field Marshal Henri-Philippe Pétain, head of the new French Vichy regime, governed the southern part of the metropolitan continental France and French North Africa as unoccupied territories, while most of the northern part of metropolitan France came under direct German military administration. A total of 700,000 Jews, that's 300,000 in France and 400,000 in North Africa, came under the German sphere of influence because Pétain decided to collaborate with Hitler. In the name of France and state anti-Semitism, and to solve the Jewish question, Pétain enacted two anti-Semitic laws, Statut des Juifs in October 1940 and June 1941, applicable in Vichy-controlled areas. Jews under occupation were identified, counted, ostracized, isolated, systematically discriminated, objectified, diabolized, and deprived of their civil rights and property, the preparatory measures foreshadowing their eventual annihilation. Okay. Then, that was in 1940. In the fall of 1942, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe, planned Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. U.S. officials informed the Algerian resistance and requested their help by attacking strategic locations in Algiers, Oran, and Casablanca. The underground failed in Oran and Casablanca, but seized part of Algiers and neutralized the French 19th Army Corps on November 8, 1942. The same day, U.S. and British forces stormed the beaches of Algiers, Morocco. Of the 377 resistant members who took Algiers, 315 were Jews. So we know about the Normandy landings and D-Day, but again, we don't remember or know about the Allied forces landing in North Africa, which is only just across the, not very far from Normandy. but 3 years earlier. The Allied landings triggered the invasion of Vichy France, Tunisia by Hitler's force on November 9th, and Eisenstadt's commando, led by Walter Roth SS, also entered Tunis to complete implementation of the final solution. He was empowered to take executive measures against the civilian population, which is Nazi jargon for robbery, murder, and enslavement. During the 6 months of occupation, the ruthless Nazi regime forced the creation of a local Judenrat and imposed anti-Semitic policies, including fines, confiscation of properties, the forced wearing of yellow badge of Magen David by Jews. Approximately 5,000 Jews were sent to roughly 40 forced labor camps where they were engaged in backbreaking work overseen by statistic guards. On November 10th, 1942, Roosevelt ordered the cessation of military resistance, and Algiers became the new capital of France. 310,000 Jews about to be liberated. The Jews of French Morocco celebrated their freedom by reading the Megillat Hitler, right? Like we have on Purim, a Megillah of freedom from Haman, from Achashverosh. So they composed Megillat Hitler, celebrating the freedom from the Nazis. That Megillah describes the rise of Hitler, his deadly plan to support all the Jews in Vichy North Africa to the death camps, and how that plan was foiled because of President Roosevelt, who was in the role of King Achashverosh. Today one can see Megillat Hitler displayed in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. So that's Megillat Hitler. What is less known is the Haggadah of Hitler. So you can see on this map, not very clearly because it's a small map, but the Allied, first of all, you can see that North Africa is very, very close to Gibraltar and Spain and Europe. I guess, in New Zealand at any rate, we tend to forget how close that there's two sides of the Mediterranean, and that North Africa is very strategic in terms of war in Europe. And then we have different Allied landings in Morocco and in Algeria, and then later in Tunis, conquering and kicking out the Nazis and the French regime who ran the place. So, so talk about the specific Haggadah of Hitler. Originally published, as I said, in 1943, and it was out of print until recently, only discovered a few years ago in 2019 by someone called Johnny Schnitzer, who had a crowdfund campaign to translate it and republish it. He wrote a blog about it on the Times of Israel. He raised more than he was asked for, republished it by Printercraft Press, but now you can buy it on all online book-selling sites. He published the original text, translation into English and to Hebrew, and commentaries as well on it. So here's what the foreword says about this Haggadah. The Haggadah of Hitler. It says, if this sounds like a strange project, meaning writing such a Haggadah in 1943, it was in fact part of a genre popular in North Africa at the time. A writer named Asher Hassan in Casablanca, for example, produced the Hitler Megillot. Coiffeur's book also has a kind of Canadian answer in A.M. Klein's play on Homer, the Hitleriad, and is in the same kind of tradition as the bawdy, gruesome take on the Passover story from Sarajevo, the partisan Haggadah, written in Ladino by a Jewish guerrilla fighter. So we have, even though it sounds strange to us to have a Haggadah of Hitler, it fits into a genre of taking Jewish texts and applying them to the current situation that people had experienced. And the same idea we have B'chol dor v'dor, in every generation you have to see yourself as if you had left Egypt. So here, the Egypt they left was the Vichy government locking them up, imposing rules on them, and the general terrors of war and the bombings and the starvation and things like that. So here are some selections which are not direct translations necessarily, but we have to do. I took these. If you go online to this website, you can see the whole Haggadah, the original version, not the reprinted version by Schnitzer, the original one on this Gross Family Collection website, and you can flick through it. So the beginning, right, we have what would be Halach Ma'anya in a regular Haggadah. You can see on the left, or maybe you can't. It's very, if you're not used to reading Arabic, as I am not, it's very difficult to read. This is B'vahilu, and then B'zerche Izav L'merchan Halach Ma'had Luzer Dauf I don't even know how to read the words that translate them. Anyway, apparently this means in haste quickly came the Americans. This bread, these emaciated faces of our ancestors in panic from Hitler. All who are hungry, may they walk in fear. All who are in need, flee in trembling. This year here, next year in tranquility. This year in the black market, next year in Palestine, free people. So this is laying out from the beginning the goal. Now, I imagine or guess that they would have recited this Haggadah not instead of the regular Haggadah of Pesach, as much as they would have been able to do that, but as well as it, or maybe it was written and not used at Seder at all. But nevertheless, it follows the structure of the regular Haggadah, more or less, or at least the first part of the Haggadah to Hallel, follows that structure, but retells it, recasts it in a contemporary light. So we have the four sons, for example, and I can't really tell you what the four sons ask because I can't understand it, but I can tell you that the Chacham is L'Ingliz, is the English, is the wise son. The Rasha is Hitler. The Tam is Lamirach, the Americans, and Shena Yadea, the one you don't know, is Mussolini, who is not worthy of our words. So because the Libyan controlled, Italian controlled Libya. So those are the four sons. He talks about, and again, I'm sorry I couldn't give you the Hebrew, but anyway, not Hebrew, the Judeo-Arabic. In the text, we have Rabbi Joseph Stalin, an allied leader, subbing in for the traditional Rabbi Josie, asking how it might be inferred that Berlin suffered 10 plagues and Hamburg 50 plagues. Those plagues included the flying fortresses, flamethrowers, and the Royal Air Force. The Axis forces are treated similarly in the text, which poses the question, this Italy that we are fighting, for what reason? It goes on to explain, because of Mussolini, who stuck to Hitler, saying, be careful not to betray me. And it brought upon them Montgomery, and their dough didn't even have time to turn into macaroni. And then the Eighth Army appeared, and they immediately fled. Toward the end of the text, we read that had Charles de Gaulle, tantamount to God, he revoked the anti-Jewish laws, but not reinstated Jews in their positions, Dayenu, it would have been enough. So the author has a sense of humor here, saying, instead of the matzah, we have their dough turning into macaroni for the Italians, because Jews always laugh about things and always have a sense of humor. So here's some more pieces from this. The Hitler Haggadah stands as a remarkable historical document that bridges ancient Jewish tradition with modern historical events. Written at, I'll be honest, this was written by a new AI I just discovered called Manus, which is a great summary here. Written at a pivotal moment in history after the liberation of Morocco by Allied forces, but while the war was still ongoing, it captures both the relief of liberation and awareness of the ongoing suffering of European Jews, because in 1943, there were still 2 more years of war in Europe, and the Holocaust was really just gearing up. Through its creative adaptation of the traditional Passover narrative, the Hitler Haggadah offers valuable insights into the North African Jewish experience during World War II, and often overlooked perspective in Holocaust historiography. In rediscovering and translation into English and Hebrew, its rediscovery and translation into English and Hebrew have made this unique text accessible to a wider audience, enriching our understanding of Jewish responses to the Holocaust across different geographical and cultural contexts. So that is one Haggadah that is a product of its time, can only be understood in the context of World War II and the persecution of Jews in North Africa, and as a response to it. Similarly, we have the Survivors Haggadah, which was European, 1946, the first Pesach after the end of the Shoah, after the end of the Holocaust, and the main 3 people involved in producing this were, 2 of them had survived the concentration camps, and all 3 of them were in displaced person camps after the war. So to give it the context, the Survivors Haggadah represents one of the most poignant and historically significant Jewish religious texts to emerge from the aftermath of the Holocaust. Created in 1946 by Holocaust survivors in displaced person camps near Munich, Germany, this unique Haggadah adapted the traditional Passover narrative of liberation from slavery in Egypt to reflect the survivors' recent liberation from Nazi concentration camps. Again, this is B'chol Dor Vador. In every generation, you see yourself as if you've lived Egypt, but also the more recent suffering or miracles of salvation seem to override the older memories of leaving Egypt. Originally titled Passover Seder Service Deutsche Theater Restaurant, Munich, Germany, April 15 and 16, 1946, this document stands as a powerful testament to Jewish resilience, their struggle to process trauma through religious tradition, and the early efforts to commemorate the Holocaust. I would add to that it also has a very strong, expressed a very strong desire to return to Israel, a Zionist intent, if you will, and blaming the Jews for not having, and the world for not having gone to Israel earlier. So here's the historical context. And again, something that even if we know about the Holocaust, something we don't necessarily think about, that after surviving the horrors of the concentration camps, hundreds of thousands of Jews were left in displaced person camps across Europe right up until as late as 1952. So after World War II and the Holocaust, hundreds of thousands of survivors found themselves in displaced person camps across Europe. From 1945 to 1952, more than 250,000 Jewish displaced persons lived in camps and urban centers in Germany, Austria, and Italy, administered by Allied authorities and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. Many of these camps were ironically former concentration camps and German army camps. Survivors found themselves still living behind barbed wire, still subsisting on inadequate amounts of food, and still suffering from shortages of clothing, medicine, and supplies. So not even though they had survived the Holocaust and the war, they were still suffering for years afterwards as the Allies sought, the American government primarily, and Jewish agencies sought to care and look after these people and rehome them. Just a quick timeline, again generated by AI. Right, May 1945 is the end of World War II in Europe and the liberation of concentration camps. Now, again, that happened in specific cities at different times, but by May, the wars ended. In the summer of 1945, we have the Earl Harrison report, which leads to improved conditions for Jewish displaced persons in separate camps. No, it's not actually in order, is it? But in April of 1946, we have the first Seder held after liberation. 1946 to 48, there's 250,000 Jewish survivors in displaced person camps. By 1948, we have the establishment of the State of Israel. In 1952, they closed the last of the displaced person camps, and the survivors either go to Israel or to the United States or back to where they came from or to other places. So the three authors, or it's not quite right, but the three people involved in creating this Survivors Haggadah, first and foremost is Rabbi Abram J. Klausner, who was an American army chaplain, and I'll tell you more about him in the next couple of slides. He led the Seders, and he was responsible. He wrote the introduction and gave context to this, and probably was responsible for publishing this Haggadah. Yosef Dov Shainson wrote the actual text of the Haggadah in Hebrew and in Yiddish. Now, I haven't included any of the Yiddish pages, partly because I don't speak Yiddish and partly because I already had enough, I think, in what I did include, but you'll have to, well, you can look at, there's a link to show you again, if you go back, this PDF is available on the WebYeshiva website, and there I have a link to the whole document on archive.org. So anyway, so Yosef Dov Shainson, also known as Ber Shainson, wrote the text, the Hebrew text of Haggadah. Miklos Adler from Debrecen in Hungary created the pictures, the woodcuts that accompany this, the Haggadah, and as we'll see, they are as poignant as the text itself. This Haggadah, if I said the Hitler Haggadah was not meant to replace the Pesach Haggadah, but was possibly even tongue-in-cheek or to accompany it. This Haggadah, Survivors Haggadah, does seem to have been intended, was used at the first Seder after the war, and does have most of the text of the Haggadah, a lot of the text of the Haggadah. so may have been used instead of the regular Haggadah. I want to talk for a few minutes about Rabbi Abram Klausner, because I had never heard of him before, but remarkable person. 1915 to 2007, was a Reform Rabbi, United States Army captain, and chaplain who became a father figure for the more than 30,000 emaciated survivors found at Dachau concentration camp 10 miles northwest of Munich shortly after it was liberated on April 29, 1945. He also cared for thousands more left homeless in camps as the victorious Allied forces determined where they should go. I'm going to read this from Wikipedia. Following ordination, Klausner joined the army and served as a chaplain at the Lawson General Hospital, Atlanta, Georgia. Klausner eventually shipped out to Germany and was assigned to join the 116th Evacuation Hospital, which had just entered Dachau. The 116th Evacuation Hospital arrived in Dachau, which was north of Munich, in May 1945, 3 weeks after the camp had been liberated on April 29th. While Rabbi Eli Bonin was the first Jewish chaplain in the United States Army to arrive at the camp, Bonin's unit remained only a short time. Rabbi Klausner arrived soon after. During the first days at Dachau, survivors asked him over and over if he knew their family members and if he could provide aid in finding them. Experiences such as these convinced Klausner of the importance of working to reunite families that had been separated by the war. In the several weeks that the 116th was stationed in Dachau, Rabbi Klausner worked to find the 32,000 survivors bedding and food, including kosher provisions. He also worked to put together lists of survivors at Dachau and made sure these lists, which he called She'eret HaPleita, the surviving remnant, were posted at other camps. Klausner would eventually publish 6 volumes of She'eret HaPleita lists and distributed them worldwide. He traveled throughout Bavaria looking for survivors, helping to unite families, and setting up a center for survivors at the Deutsche Museum in Munich. Those who did not find the names of relatives on the She'eret HaPleita list wrote notes and tacked them to the walls at the center in the hopes that relatives might visit and find them. When the 116th was ordered to move on to an army rest camp, Klausner initially went with them, but then surreptitiously returned to Dachau against army orders and told the commander of the 127th Evacuation Hospital Unit at Dachau that he had been reassigned. Eventually, the 127th would also depart on a day Klausner was traveling in Bavaria, allowing Klausner to remain behind once again. When Earl G. Harrison, Dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School and U.S. Representative to the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees, arrived in Germany in July 1945 to investigate conditions at the DP camps. On an assignment from Acting Secretary of State Joseph Gruen through Gru's efforts, carrying a letter of interest and support from President Truman, Klausner met with him in Dachau and served as his guide in visits to the camps at Landsberg, Feldafing, St. Artelien, and elsewhere, making sure that Harrison became acquainted with representatives of the Jewish DPs and observed firsthand the actual conditions. Harrison's report to President Truman maintained that the living conditions of the DPs under the supervision of the United States Army were not much better than they had been under the Nazis. Harrison also recommended that the Jewish survivors should be sent to Palestine rather than sending back to their countries of origin, an idea Klausner actively supported. On orders from General Eisenhower, conditions soon improved in the camps. Again, the context is that, well, we'll see in the next page or so, the context is that Jews didn't have the means necessary to go back to where they come from. Their houses, their possessions had been taken by others. In some places, there were pogroms and murders of Jews in 1946 because anti-Semitism was still running rife, even though the Nazis had been defeated. So the idea of rehousing people in Israel, which was at the time called Palestine, was something which Klausner supported. He wrote at least 4 books. Just after the establishment of the State of Israel, Klausner left the military and began recruiting pilots and nurses for the Israeli Defense Forces in the United States. He became provost of the Hebrew Union College in 1948, which is the flagship Reform seminary training school, and was a senior rabbi at Temple Israel in Boston from 1949 to 1953. During this time, Klausner earned a doctorate in divinity at Harvard University. He was the rabbi at Temple Emmanuel in Yonkers from 1954 until his retirement in 1989, when he moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico. He wrote several books, including Weddings, a Complete Guide to All Religious and Interfaith Marriage Services, which provide texts of Protestant, Roman Catholic, Jewish, Russian Orthodox, and Muslim wedding services, and suggestions for combining texts of different faiths. He wrote a child's prayer book and his memoir, A Letter to My Children, From the Edge of the Holocaust. He was also featured in the 1997 Academy Award-winning documentary The Long Way Home about Holocaust survivors in the immediate aftermath of the liberation of the concentration camps. So he is the person leading the Seder, coming from a very, very different background. The concept of an American Reform rabbi would have, I imagine, been foreign to basically everybody in these displaced persons camps, even though Reform originated in Germany, and Germany had its own version of Reform. Hungary had its different version of Neolog. But I think the concept of American Reform would have been very foreign, and the background and the ideas and the values bringing from America would have been very different than what the people in these camps had been used to. So Miklos Adler created the woodcuts, the images for the Haggadah, and they are all images of persecution by the Nazis, retitled, or at least, and put in the context of phrases from the Haggadah or from the Tanakh. So printmaker and painter Miklos Adler was born in Debrecen in Hungary. He attended the Academy of Fine Arts in Budapest from 1923 to 1934, before returning to his hometown where he taught at a Jewish high school. In 1944, Adler and his family were arrested and deported to Auschwitz, but their train was rerouted to the terrorist concentration camp in Czechoslovakia, which was liberated in May 1945. After the war, Adler returned to his hometown and continued his arts career, producing a series of 16 woodcuts, 7 of which appear in a Survivors Haggadah used by Jewish survivors at displaced person camps near Munich for the first Passover after the war. And in 1960, Adler immigrated to Israel. So again, the context is that even after the Holocaust ended, the Jews were not, it wasn't as simple as, okay, let's just everyone go home again, live happily ever after. In the months before the end, the Germans had driven thousands of prisoners on forced marches from the eastern death camps to the west, partly in the last hope of providing slave labor for their factories, partly as a killing method. In most cases, only a few of the marches survived, and many of those few were dying as the war ended. In the concentration camps, for weeks after liberation, starvation and disease and death were rampant, even after a sustaining diet was introduced and medical attention given. And for those who survived these dark post-liberation weeks, conditions did not change enough to speak of real liberation. Many of the survivors were still confined in the camps, often behind barbed wire, guarded now by Allied soldiers under conditions of continued deprivation. Of the tens of millions of European DPs, the surviving Jews were a very small number and were thrown together in the DP camps with non-Jewish DPs of entirely different kind, many of whom were often vehemently anti-Semitic. There were large numbers of them from the Baltics, Ukraine, elsewhere, who had volunteered to work in German factories and fields, people reasonably well fed and never imprisoned or tortured. There were those who had collaborated in the East and been driven west by Soviet advances, now homeless and fearful of returning home. There were even numbers of Soviet deserters or prisoners of war who had formed several active units fighting for the German army. There were Polish DPs who may themselves have been in the Nazi camps or driven from their homes by one army or the next. Finally, there were the German civilian DPs themselves, some returning home from conquered territories, some ethnic Germans driven from countries where they'd been long settled. As for the Jews who had on their own headed home to Poland or Ukraine, they met with anti-Semitic hostility and violence and were refused their property. Some of this violence, winked at or supported by the new governments and eventually leading to full-scale pogroms, drove these Jews too back to the DP camps in the West, this unfolding drama a kind of last act of the Holocaust. So just as we sometimes forget, or I often forget about the impact of the Holocaust in North Africa, also we forget that after the World War II finished, the horrors of the Holocaust, the immediate horrors of the Holocaust ended, but the continuing suffering happened for many more years. So here is, this is from the text of the Survivors Haggadah, explaining a bit more about the specific context of this Haggadah and how it came to be, how it was able to be printed. You'll see there's a big A on the cover here of this text. So from this cover of the Haggadah, we learn 3 things. First, by the A insignia of the US Third Army, the Army of Occupation for Southern Germany, we know that the army printed it. Second, by the legend and date that it is used to celebrate the first Passover after the defeat of Nazi Germany. Third, by announcement of place that all this was being done not in a DP camp, but in the city of Munich, meaning they presumably took people from the camps to Munich to this hotel for the Seder, because it would have been difficult to hold it in the camp with where it was predominantly non-Jews. Looking inside at the text, one might ask, where and how was the Hebrew Yiddish type to be found in Judenrein, Germany, that had attempted to destroy all traces of Jewish life? By spring of 1945, Jewish voluntary agencies had brought a good deal of Hebrew and Yiddish type for the DPs in Germany. At the same time, the ICD, the Information Control Division of the American military government, had secured Hebrew and Yiddish type, along with other typefaces, and extensive printing facilities for use in a variety of publications, including books and periodicals by or for DPs. This program was so extensive that it was characterized as equivalent in output to a major American publishing house. One of the officers of the ICD recalled how the print facilities were secured and established for the occupation, and he quotes, "We would confiscate printing plants that had belonged to the Nazi Party and individual Nazis and lease them to the new publishers, search out supplies of newsprint and ink, arrange for the salvage of bombed-out presses, and supervise the swap of beer and cheese for a British zone zinc needed for making photographic plates." My brother, a bunch of years ago, on his blog, between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, wrote about the survivors' Talmud. They printed a set of Talmud to be used by survivors in DP camps, and many other texts as well that were provided by the American military. So here we have Klausner writing this preface. Right? So what I quoted from before, the introduction, was written by the people who republished the text. Klausner at the time wrote as follows, in part: "And the khaki-clad sons of Israel, commanded by Lieutenant General Truscott, gathered together, as was the custom in Israel, to celebrate the Passover festival. They came from the 9th Division in the West and the 1st Division in the East. They came from the 98th General Hospital and from the 24th Dispensary. They came from the CIC, the CID, the ICD, the UNRA, and the American Joint Distribution Committee. All of them came to the city of Munich, there to relate, as of old, the miracle of freedom. They spoke of Pharaoh and the Egyptian bondage. They spoke of slave labor and the torture cities of Pithom and Ramses, and they spoke of the inevitable force of liberty, which will lay waste to every tyrannical design. But in their hearts they felt very close to all that which was narrated. Pharaoh and Egypt gave way to Hitler and Germany. Pithom and Ramses faded beneath fresh memories of Buchenwald and Dachau." So that is the context of this Haggadah. It begins, the title page, the first page, with "We were slaves to Hitler and Germany," and you see the illustrations on the side. The Brausbad is the shower. It means the crematoria, the showers that the prisoners had to go through before where they were told were showers. They're really the concentration camps. You see people being burnt and being tortured, and the smoke from the crematoria. This is the context of this Haggadah. We have a picture by Miklos Adler. It says in Hebrew, "Avadim haynu leFaro b'Mitzrayim," we were slaves to Egypt, to Pharaoh in Egypt. But the picture is of the slave labor of the concentration camps of the Jews working for the Nazis. We dug the trenches in an unending circle. So the Haggadah has on this page, which is the quote I began this shir with. And if you look at the top of the letter bet, which is stylized, the top is the pyramids in Egypt and the palm trees, and the bottom of the concentration camps and the smokestacks of the crematoria and the guard towers of the Nazis. And all on the outside we have I think is the fruit and the flowers of the land of Israel. So again, the commentary on this page, written afterwards, is the dramatic letter bet begins above in every generation. Where's the echo through the traditional Haggadah? Is the bet that is the first letter of the first word of the Torah Bereshit. The very genesis of Genesis in the beginning. This letter has occupied rabbis through generations of biblical commentary. Here, the graphic bet seems to encompass all the generations that came before the smokestacks of German pyramids, of German pyramids built of palm trees and Holocaust of camps, furnaces, and chimneys. And between them is the Brausbada, which is the shower bath, referring to the crematoria. So here they ask, right? Like we ask in our Haggadah that we will read on Motzei Shabbat in a few days' time, why do we eat the bitter herbs? But the answer here is different. Al Shum Sha'anu Chalomek Toret Hagalot. that we were dreamt about or intoxicated by the incense of the exile. Ashum barachnu migalot legalot, that we fled from one exile to another. Al shum shamanu, because we said kol asher hagia le'achenu timol v'chol asher hagia lehem ba'eretz miguram lo yagia elenu. We said that anything that happens to our brothers elsewhere won't happen to us. Al shum hem atnu lasot al nafshenu k'dei lakim et beitenu u'meditatenu shenechrevu, because we didn't do enough to establish our homes and our country that would have saved ourselves. So, saying the bitter herbs we're suffering because we didn't, because we enjoyed the exile and didn't come back to Israel. And then again, this print is very small. I had to use AI to help me read it, and this is the end of the, even AI couldn't read it so well. But it talks about, in the context here, after we said, right, we've gone through the bitter herbs, we'll eat it. Then it talks about why, what we're doing. So, Misharu Chased Yomot Haolam, not only is an indictment of the Jews who are too comfortable in exile, but an indictment of the Jews, of the non-Jews who sat around watching. When the Chasidei Yomot Haolam, the righteous of the nations, when they saw what was going on, they saw Ki Hitler Gazar Lakol Avinu Mechlet Israel, that Hitler had decreed and was destroying Israel. Das Sanhedrin Gedol Hashem, the great Sanhedrin, their courts stood up and said, Merav Akol Chriza Al Ashtika, and they, because of their great mourning, Merav Evel, they said, let's be silent. But their tongue stuck to their palate. They spent a short while mourning with their heads lowered, which was the mourning custom of the time. And Hitler, while the non-Jews are standing around saying, oh, those poor Jews, oh, I wish we could help them, Hitler is setting his starving dogs on the babies, and the dogs tore them to pieces. Hitler went and built gas chambers, shanim and crematoria, and destroyed Israel. And all the while, the righteous of the nations are saying, oh, we're so sorry, there's nothing we can do, which, of course, is a very famous idea from that time, which is brought out, in the media aftermath. Mishirad Shalom, when peace came down to earth, the people of Israel were gathering. The surviving remnants were coming out of caves, out of forests, and out of death camps, returned to the lands of their exile. The people of those lands greeted them and said, we thought you were no longer alive, and here you are, so many of you, 50,000 out of 3 million. And they sent the survivors all sorts of messages telling them to leave the land, even killing them. And the people of Israel ran for their lives. They were sneaking across borders, only to be robbed of everything they had. And they abandoned their monies and they saved their lives. They went to Bavaria in order to go up to our Holy Land. And then Claude, I forgot to delete that from Claude, so I've been caught out for using AI to translate that. So again, they're sitting in a hotel, or in a building which is a hotel in Munich, talking about the Holocaust, talking about leaving Egypt, and at the same time they're talking about the difficulties of staying in Europe and trying to leave Europe. And again, Adler created this image of Zachanu et Daga when the Israelites went into the desert with Moshe. They complained before they had the manna. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt, and he's got a picture of here of the Holocaust era of lining up for food in the either in the displaced person camps or in the concentration camps, and he calls this reward for our labor. And we have here the 4 sons. So, and again, you hear here very strongly the Zionist undertone of this Haggadah. So, and I'm not going to try and read the Hebrew, it's too small, but this is the Claude translation. Actually, I used Grok for this translation. What does the wise son say? What is this land and state that you long for? Is not my house your house? Is not the whole country open before you? Why do you not know another country where men can breathe more freely? You should tell them, were you not the first to cry out for home and country at the time of your need? Well, this is the hour of our need, and we demand a homeland. Every nation, even the least and lowest, is permitted to have a homeland, whereas a people as ancient and neglected as we are is not permitted. How could this be justified? You should tell them, who knows how long their charity and their protective arm shall be extended to us. A home in a country should not come out of charity, but by right. This is the wise son, 2 years before the establishment of the State of Israel, talking about the need for a homeland. Right? The British White Paper is limiting the number of Jews who can go to Israel. What does the wicked son say? What is there no room for you here, that you should scramble into the land of Israel? Why, the whole world is open before you. And what's more, you have a mission. Go and use your strength to rebuild a devastated Europe. You should set his teeth on edge and tell him, we have tried to give our best to Europe, and in return they build gas chambers and crematoria and exterminate with cruel ingenuity. Should we, for all this, rebuild Europe? You should tell them, had they been in the place and been saved, they wouldn't have renounced the very cause for which they fought so bravely, that is, for a home and a country. The simple son, what does he say? What is this? Why do you want to huddle in so small a land? And what about Ishmael, meaning the Arab nations? Why? You should tell them, we are not building our houses with a mighty hand by the exploitation of others. We made bread out of the wilderness. And as for Ishmael, Israel will not overlook his rights. And for the son who is too young to know how to ask, you should begin by saying, and then we go on with the rest of the Haggadah. And this Dayenu, right? We're going to say on Motzei Shabbat and Sunday night, we're going to talk about Dayenu, that if God had given us only this and not the next, and saying better and better and greater things that God gave us. But in the displaced persons camp, immediately after Holocaust, Dayenu took on a different flavor. Right, Dayenu, we would have been content. Had he scattered us among the nations, but not given us the first crusade, we would have been content. Had he given us the first crusade, but not the second, we would have been content. Had he given us the second crusade, but not the blood libel, we would have been content. Had he given us the blood libel, but not the persecutions of the third crusade, we would have been content. Had he given us the persecutions of the third crusade, but not the badge of shame, we would have been content. Had he given us the badge of shame, but not the persecutions of the Black Plague, we would have been content. Had he given us the persecutions of the Black Plague, but not the Inquisition, we would have been content. Had he given us the Inquisition, but not the pogroms of 1648 to 49, we would have been content. Had he given us the pogroms of 1648 to 49, but not the slaughter of 1919 in Ukraine, we would have been content. Had he given us the slaughter in Ukraine, but not Hitler, we would have been content. Had he given us Hitler, but no ghettos, we would have been content. Had he given us ghettos, but no gas chambers and crematoria, we would have been content. Had he given us gas chambers and crematoria, but our wives and children had not been tortured, we would have been content. Had our wives and children been tortured, but we had not been forced into hard bondage, we would have been content. Had we been forced into hard bondage, but not been made to die of hunger, we would have been content. Had we been made to die of hunger, but not of disease and torture, we would have been content. All the more so, since all these have befallen us. We must make aliyah, even if illegally, wipe out the galut, build the chosen land to make a home for ourselves and our children for eternity. So I want to transition from that Haggadah, which virtually ends with a plea to make aliyah, with a Haggadah that came out, I don't know if it came out, I think last Pesach, but might be just for this Pesach, called the Haggadah of Freedom, which is a traditional Haggadah, but also incorporates what life is like post-October 7th, post the Hamas attack and slaughter of 1,200 people, and with hostages still being held in Gaza. So we have, the Haggadah has the regular text in Hebrew and English, and in the yellow blocks on the side has quotes from survivors or relatives of people who were killed in Gaza. So, for example, we have from Ofri Perry, whose father was murdered by Hamas in Gaza. How different this night is. For our family, the biggest change is our father's absence from the Seder table. This year, we no longer have hope he might return to us. As a nation, we live with the reality that our lives have changed dramatically. And on this night, we ask ourselves, how do we move forward, and what the future holds for us after this catastrophe? When we try to answer these questions along with the fear that we will not recover, we cling to the hope and faith in our people that things will change for the better, and that we'll be the ones who bring that real change here. Just one more quote from the Haggadah, because it's too powerful. I mean, if you can have access to it, you should read it yourselves and use it as Seder. Larry Albach, who survived a year of captivity in Gaza, who says, who redeemed us and redeemed our ancestors from Egypt, who brought us to this night on which we eat mutton and bitter herbs. There was one moment of hope in the perpetual darkness we were held in, and that took place on Passover, as Agam Berger and I prepared to mark the Seder. A few days before the holiday, I took a pen and paper and improvised a Haggadah. I wrote down verses from a Seder we had, drew some pictures, and added Passover songs. We sat down for the Seder. It was a bonding moment. I felt a sense of the Haggadah for Agam and I. Despite our difficulties, it was important for us to observe the holiday and maintain the belief that our freedom would come soon. We prayed that the holiday would bring with it the news we so yearned for. Although we were not released then, that moment gave us the strength to carry on. So in every generation, we have to experience leaving Egypt. And in this generation, unfortunately, it's only too easy for us to experience that. So I just want to end on a more positive note. Jeremiah says, God says that days are coming. And we won't say, the living God who brought us out of the land of Egypt. We'll say the living God who brought the children of Israel from the northern lands, from all the lands that were exiled there, and we come back to our own land. And the Gemara Brachot, which again, WebEx has meant I can't read the Hebrew, so I'm just going to quickly scroll down to my PowerPoint to read it. And it says, the Mishnah says, and we know this because it's part of the Seder of the Haggadah, we have to mention the exodus from Egypt at night, which literally means, right, the question is, why do we say the third paragraph of the Shema in the evening Shema when it talks primarily about Tzitzit, which is a daytime mitzvah? The answer is because we have to mention the exodus from Egypt. So we mention the exodus from Egypt at night. Amr Belazar ben Azariah, Hariani kevin shivim shana. I am like one who is 70 years old. I never understood why we should say Yetziat Mitzrayim b'leilot, that we have to mention Exodus from Egypt at night. Ad shedrasha ben Zoma, until Ben Zoma explained as follows: Shneemar leman tizkor et yom tzedcha me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yemei chayecha, in order that you remember the day you left Egypt, all the days of your life. Yemei chayecha hayamim kol yemei chayecha leilot, the days of your life refers to the day, and kol yemei chayecha, the extra word kol, means the nighttime. Now, he means that literally day and night, but also metaphorically. We have to remember the exodus from Egypt in times that are like day, when we're doing well, and in times that are like night, when we're suffering and being tortured and enslaved again. So that's Elazar ben Azariah. V'chachamim omrim yemei chayecha olam hazeh. Chachamim say, yemei chayecha means we remember the exodus from Egypt in this world. Kol the kol means even when Mashiach comes, even when we'll be celebrating the salvation from all of the other troubles that happened to us for the last 3,000 years since we left Egypt, we'll still remember the exodus from Egypt. That will still be relevant and not be surpassed by all the other times we've been saved and brought out of bondage and slavery. So the Gemara says, and again, the words are there, Tanya, it was taught, Amar lehem ben Zoma l'chachamim. Ben Zoma said to the Chachamim, V'kim mazkirin Yetziat Mitzrayim liyamot HaMashiach. Will we talk about Exodus from Egypt when Mashiach is here? Halak kvar ne'amar, didn't Jeremiah say, Hinei yamim ba'im no'am Hashem, v'lo yamru od chai Hashem asher ela et bnei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim, ki im chai Hashem asher ela et asher hafi et zeh beit Yisrael me'eretz tzfono me'kol hatzod asher hidachtim sham. We'll say, the living God who brought us out of all the land of our exile, who brought us from the north and all the other countries. And then Amrullah, the Chachamim, the sages, said to Ben Zoma, said to Elazar ben Azariah, that doesn't mean that we won't remember the exodus from Egypt. The salvation from the other slaveries and exiles and persecutions will be the main thing we give thanks for. But we'll also give thanks to God who brought us out of Egypt, because that was the foundation of our nation. That was a formative influence on all of us, and every other exile, every other suffering we have is a piece of or connected to the suffering from Egypt. So this year I just want to more poignant than for a long time. We end the Haggadah. When we get to Nir Tzah, the end of the Haggadah, and we've finished the Seder of Pesach. Just as we merited to do it, may we merit in the future. And we end the Seder, or at least the main part of the Seder, with L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim habenuyah, next year in Jerusalem rebuilt. So please God, we should all merit together to come and to be redeemed, brought out of the slavery of the exile, to be redeemed from all of the suffering and persecution that the Jews around the world are suffering, and particularly Jews fighting against Hamas and Jews held in captivity and hostage by Hamas. May we all be redeemed, brought out of slavery, brought from darkness to light, and merit to meet and celebrate in Jerusalem. And please God, I'll be giving you shiurim in person in Jerusalem very soon. Thank you very much, everybody. Chag kasher v'sameach. Have a wonderful Pesach. And sign up for my next class, which is Yom HaShoah. I can't remember exactly the date. It's at a slightly earlier, a couple of hours earlier. So those who are in New Zealand will probably have to listen to the recording. And then after that, I'll be giving, I think after, I can't remember exactly when, I'll be giving a series of classes on Pirkei Avot and the Zugot in Pirkei Avot, the pairs of rabbis in Pirkei Avot. So thank you all very much. Have a wonderful Pesach.